Alright, welcome back. We were looking at the Crusades in the previous video. We looked at the social, political, economic, and spiritual reasons to go on crusades. Now we're really going to start looking at really what the Crusades were all about, what happened, and what the results of the Crusades were. Alright, the Pope in this particular case was Pope Urban II. He's going to be the man responsible for the Crusades because it's going to be his passionate call, his passionate plea to Christians to go reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity that inspires tens of thousands of people to make this 3,000-mile journey from their homes in Europe down to Jerusalem, a place where most of them had never even visited before. So it all starts with Pope Urban II. So what happened? Let's start with the First Crusade. And we're not going to go and look at each and every crusade, although I am going to talk about the First, Second, and Third Crusade in the process here today. So Pope Urban II called for a holy war against Muslims controlling the Holy Lands. Again, if we look at this map, and it's fairly small, but it gives us an idea here. Here's Europe. This is actually going to be the path of the First Crusade as taken by Godfrey of Bouillon, who, if you watch the Crusades video, you saw his story. And they're going to go through Constantinople and then down to Jerusalem here. And it takes about 3 years for that to happen. The Muslims had taken over Jerusalem, and this information got back to the Pope and said, we can't have that. Jerusalem's such a holy city for us, we can't have Saracens, which is another word for Muslims. We can't have the Saracens controlling that city, so let's go take it back. So Urban's call brought tremendous support for the crusade. A lot of people signed up for this immediately and were excited to go. Again, those who went on crusade, and especially those who died on crusade, were assured a ticket to heaven. You imagine the miserable lives that most of the people lived in Europe at the time. Fairly simple, didn't have a lot of money. Certainly a lot of them didn't have wealth. This would have been very exciting to say, hey, I know I'm going to paradise. I'm going to heaven when I die, and here's a chance for me to go secure my soul in the afterlife. One of the main cries of the Christian Crusaders was God wills it. So God wills it was the battle cry. As mentioned, this was a 3,000-mile journey from Europe to Jerusalem on average. I mean, obviously, if some people were leaving from this region here, it might be 2,500 miles instead of 3,000. But 3,000 is the rough number that we use here to describe the journey. Now, when the Christians first set out, they definitely had a very large number. We're talking 20, 30,000 strong. By the time they reached Jerusalem in 1099, only 12,000 were left. So eventually 12,000 Christians approached Jerusalem and besieged it for a month. Now, the walls of Jerusalem are big. They came across a very, very good stroke of fortune. They were able to find enough timber to create two 50-foot siege towers. And Godfrey and his men were able to essentially find the weak spot in the wall, and they broke through and were able to get into Jerusalem. And when they did that, on July 15th, 1099, the Christians captured the city. They killed thousands of Muslims in the process and reclaimed the city for Christianity. So in the process, the Christians slaughtered all of the Muslims left in the city. And of course, this is going to leave a very bitter taste in the Muslims' eyes, thinking that, hey, we can't allow this. There's going to be a revenge factor here. Nobody really likes it when they lose a battle like this. Now, the Muslim army, under the command of a leader named Saladin, captured Jerusalem again in 1187. So the Christians captured the city in the First Crusade, and then shortly here later, less than 100 years later, the Muslims were able to take over once again. Well, of course, the Pope's going to hear about this, and he's going to call for another crusade. So the Second Crusade, again, was to recapture Jerusalem. So the Christians crusade to defeat Saladin and recapture the city. But here's where we need to become very, very honest. Yes, the First Crusade is successful, at least in the eyes of the Christians. They recapture the city. But every single crusade after that is a failure. The Second Crusade is a failure. Third Crusade is a failure. Fourth, fifth, sixth, you name it. The Christians are unable to regain control of the city once they lose it here to Saladin. Here's a picture of Saladin. I'm going to talk a little bit about the film Kingdom of Heaven. I show that film in my History Through Film class. It really is about the Second Crusade, or building up to the Second Crusade when Saladin takes the city, and he's featured prominently in that film, and I think they do a really good job of portraying him. So I highly recommend taking a look at that movie. So here's the poster of it, really building up to the Second Crusade. In the film Kingdom of Heaven, the Christians lose the city to Saladin, setting up the Second Crusade. So, we said in the Second Crusade, the Christians are trying to fight Saladin. They fail. We've got the Third Crusade, which is led by three of Europe's most powerful monarchs, or kings. That's what monarch stands for, is a king. Well, you have Philip II of France, who eventually turned around and went home. You have German Emperor Frederick, who unfortunately drowned on the journey. And what we're left here is, and you can kind of see this on this map, is from England, we have Richard the Lionheart. So Richard the Lionheart, or Richard the Lionhearted, as you see here, is going to be the major Christian leader here by the time the Christians reach Jerusalem during the Third Crusade. And he's going to fight many battles against Saladin. He is not going to recapture the city, but he does agree to a truce with Saladin in 1192. This is significant because this shows us the compassion that Saladin has. Saladin's not a villain. He doesn't want to slaughter Christians. And he could have, because not only did he have a big enough army to do so, but he also had that revenge factor, because when the Christians first took the city in 1099, they slaughtered all the Muslims that were there. But Saladin wasn't like that. He didn't want to return that favor. So he fights many battles with King Richard the Lionhearted. They agree to this truce, and under this truce, Jerusalem stayed under Muslim control. Sorry, that picture is covering that up there. But Jerusalem stayed under Muslim control, but Saladin promised that unarmed Christians could freely visit the city's holy places. I'll read that again. I'm sorry, it's covered up. Saladin promised that unarmed Christians could freely visit the city's holy places. Well, what was amazing about this is Christians now had access to Jerusalem again, and that was a really, really big deal. The Pope still wanted to control the city, but that's not going to happen here. But at least now Christians could come in and visit, where Jesus was crucified, and many of the other holy sites, the Holy Sepulchre, some of the Jewish temple, and other Jewish sites. So there was definitely sort of a silver lining here. Yes, we don't control the city, but at least we can come into the city here. Now, there were other attempts. I told you there was 8 or 9 crusades. Like I said, we're not going to go through all of those. Really, the First, Second, Third Crusade are the most significant ones. The Fourth Crusade failed to recapture Jerusalem, just as the Fifth and the Sixth and the Seventh Crusade failed. But one of my favorite crusades was in the 1200s and beyond. 4 more crusades were unsuccessful, but it's the Children's Crusade that you can see here. Really, I hate to say this is funny, but in a way it kind of is. A whole bunch of children, most of them under the age of 15, basically said, we're going to go capture Jerusalem. And they, embarked on this journey down to Jerusalem, and very few of them made it. Most of them either died of sickness or drowned on the journey. Many of them were sold into slavery on the journey. So it was a massive, massive failure, just like all of the Crusades were after the first. And again, we're looking at that from the Christian perspective. From the Muslim perspective, you'd say, every crusade after the first one was a success because we were able to hold on to the city. But from the Christian perspective, they capture the city in the First Crusade, they lose it to Saladin, and then every attempt after that failed to recapture Jerusalem. So, What changed? Why look at this? Obviously, a lot of people died. Obviously, it's going to be a fight between Christians and Muslims. But really, what are the effects? What comes out of the Crusades that's worth mentioning here? Well, there's no doubt that this is an example of church power. The church was able to convince thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians to travel to a place they had never been, spend a lot of money to go on crusade, and possibly die in a place they've never been, all in the name of their church. And so the church really must have had a very, very strong power over the people in order to convince them to do that. And so that's very, very apparent here. One of the big results economically from this is, of course, trade expanded between Europe and Southwest Asia. When you've got this many people traveling between two different regions here, Europe and Southwest Asia, of course you're going to bring goods back and you're going to continue to trade. So it's going to set up new trade caravans, it's going to set up new economic opportunities. So trade expanded between Europe and Southwest Asia. This one's probably the most obvious one. Thousands of knights and other participants lost their lives on both, well, really on all three sides. The Jews were not a part of this, but because they were infidels, they were non-believers, many of them were slaughtered along the way. So talk about the different difficulties Jews have had in their existence, from the Holocaust to the Egyptian captivity, here being slaughtered by the Crusades. So the Jews have been picked on a number of different times in history. But thousands of knights and other participants lost their lives. So thousands of Muslims died, thousands of Christians died. It was definitely a bloody war on all sides. Of course, those who survived, who went down on crusade and didn't die and traveled back to Europe, are going to bring culture with them. They're going to bring textbooks with them. They're going to bring spices with them. They're going to bring music with them. All sorts of culture is going to come back to Europe. And this predates the Renaissance, so there's a connection there. The Renaissance is going to start shortly after this. I mentioned the Jews. There was persecution of the Jews. Thousands were slaughtered because they were infidels. And again, infidel just means non-believer. There's sort of an innocent bystander in all of this. Failure of later crusades lessened the power of the Pope. I equate this to a coach. Imagine if a coach gets to the Super Bowl every year but fails to win the game. Eventually, you're going to look at that coach and go, maybe he's not the right man for the job. Maybe he's not coaching them well enough because he's their leader, right? And we're failing, they're failing to achieve their objective. Well, in a lot of ways, that's the way the Pope was viewed. The Pope keeps calling for Christians to go on crusade, and it was many different popes that did this, and ultimately Jerusalem stayed in the hands of the Muslims. So this definitely is going to make the Pope look bad. So it lessened the power of the Pope. The Crusades also weakened the power of the feudal nobility. You relied on your knights to protect your lands. Well, if your knights are down fighting in the Crusades and they die, then obviously feudalism, as we know it in Europe, is going to break down because those knights are not there to protect the land. And I think the most important effect of the Crusades is this began a legacy of bitterness and hatred of Christians for the Muslims and vice versa. We still see this in the modern world with ISIS, with Al-Qaeda, with Islamic terror groups attacking Westerners and attacking Christians, Christians hating Muslims. This all dates back. I mean, one could easily argue that if the Crusades had never occurred, we might have a much more peaceful world today, where you don't have Christians and Muslims hating each other. So this all began back with the Crusades. All right, that brings us to our result. The Crusades were a violation of thou shalt not kill. It was also an example of an abuse of church power. The effects of the Crusades are still felt through that region of the world today. You know, this should have never happened. The Pope should have known better. The Pope should have tried to find a peaceful way to make this happen, but the Pope said, go kill Muslims, go take back Jerusalem so that we can own it, and this started a 300-year system of Christians failing over and over and over and over again to reclaim that city. They were successful in the First Crusade, but every crusade after that was a massive failure. All right, let's wrap up the Crusades here by taking a second look at our constructive response question. Question says, summarize the Crusades, including causes and effects. Well, I think we need to start at the beginning with this question. We need to talk about how Pope Urban II wanted to reclaim the Holy Land of Jerusalem for Christianity. So he promised a ticket to heaven for those who wanted to go crusade, and a lot of people took up the cross to go travel 3,000 miles from Europe down to Jerusalem to try to reclaim that land for Christianity. Certainly, when we talk about that ticket to heaven, it's a pretty big Christian contradiction because if you killed and died on the crusade, especially if you killed infidels, which means non-believers, that was seen as a path to heaven. That violates thou shalt not kill, a very important commandment of Christians. But there was four main reasons why people would go on crusade. Social reason was to get knights out of Europe. They were fighting each other, kind of needed something to do. Political reasons, the Pope wanted to obtain land over his Eastern Orthodox Byzantine rival. Certainly we've got economic reasons. People wanted to make money. There were a lot of people who were able to provide loans to people, so there's money to be made. Of course, those going on crusade could actually become very wealthy in the Holy Land because there's a lot more trade and wealth flowing through that region. And the last reason, of course, is that spiritual reason. You might get a ticket to heaven. So those are the reasons to go on crusades. The effects are very large. Certainly, trade expanded. Power of some of the kings increased. We talked about King Richard, the Lionheart of England, how he signed a truce with Saladin. And we need to look at the fact that thousands of people died. There's definitely a lot of bitterness between Christians and Muslims today as a result of this. Power of the Pope was lessened simply because the Christians were unable to secure the Holy Land after the First Crusade and the fall of Jerusalem to the Muslims under Saladin. And we could go on. There's several other effects that we have from our notes, but you want to pick and choose some of the best ones there to write your little paragraph on. So that should give us a really good summary of the Crusades, including the causes and effects. Make sure you've got that in a nice, neat little paragraph. So that's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something about the Crusades. We'll talk to you next time.